Good morning and welcome back. Also a very warm welcome to those who are joining us for the first time this morning. I hope the reception and dinner yesterday has helped us all to digest yesterday's inputs. There were many and there was lots of information. I will not summarize the Science Day. This will be done later by Alan Featherstone. From science to policy. From the Science Day to the Policy Day. In yesterday's 4 sessions, and also in the parallel sessions I attended, in all of them, one of the take-home message was we need policy debates, we need better policies to make the livestock sector more sustainable. That's why later on today we will have 2 policy panels, one innovation and one on trade. But before we do this, we'll hear from the Global Agenda Action Networks what their innovation potential is and how they want to put it into action. With these short remarks, I will hand over to Eduardo Arquedias, our operation manager, who will moderate this session. Thank you and enjoy the day.
Okay, good morning. I'm really pleased to be here. As our chair said, I am Eduardo Arce Diaz, former K-State graduate, so I am very happy to be back to my alma mater too. And this morning we're going to present what our action networks have been doing regarding highlights on innovation during the last year. Action networks are very important for Kansas State, for the global agenda, because they are the technical arms of the initiative. So they produce evidence, they test it, they implement pilots, and they have great importance for us to show that good practices are really key for good policies. So I'm going to start with the Action Network number 1. We have 8 presentations today, and we hope that you will be free to contact them later on if you have any questions or if you need any further information regarding their activities. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to. I am the interim coordinator of the Action Network Closing the Efficiency Gap. I say interim because the real coordinator in the proper job will be solved soon. But we have been working together with several organizations on this. We have this is list, that's one, Closing the Efficiency Gap Action Network. The innovations that we are going to present is how we have been working together to develop a methodology to measure practice change at the farm level, because we have been talking about sustainable livestock options, sustainability, but the real question for us on the field is how to measure these. We need standardized models. We need a standardized approach to measure these. And just to provide some context of the Action Network, these are the areas that we are working in. And today, I'm going to be focusing these 2, methodological approach to measure practice change on the farm level. The question that we have been raising several institutions working with livestock projects around the globe is how to measure adoption, how to measure practice change, how to measure transitions on those practice change, how to compare baselines and sustainable livestock options, And we have been developing within the Action Network a matrix measuring forage production, animal welfare, economic results, land productivity, water efficiency, CO2 emissions, and animal productivity. Up to now, we know that we need to add other aspects like social ones, but let's be focused on those ones and see what we have been able to produce. This work has been done, led by the Tuning Institute of Farm Economics in Germany and AgriBenchmark Network, which is a network with different branches collecting information all around the world. And this work that is presented today has been working, but several GASL organizations with the need to measure practice change and to model sustainable livestock options and HIPS adoption process. These are examples of the organizations that we have been working with during the last 5 years. And I would like to be focused in the methodological approach that we have been using together. This is something that we have been refining along the process of measuring practice change. We have different steps, this that I have no time to be focused on, but I would like to remark this one, that going to the regions, making panel groups, discussing with the people at the field time, and making a methodological approach is the main core element for measuring this. We collect a lot of information from them. We discuss the information from them if they are not statistics available. The model, we have been able in AgriBenchmark and the Tuning Institute to create a model during the last 20 years for measuring whole farm level, enterprise level. And in the cattle ranching, this is an example, we have been able to measure different components of this. The model is also very much taking in detail the economic information that we used to do so and measuring economic revenues and profitability in the short, middle, and long-term approach. But also, as we have been mentioned, the production systems economics has been able to measure animal productivity, soil productivity in the model. And now we are already added during the last 4 years, the emissions component. And the latest development we have been adding to this model is also that we have been able to measure the emissions from the feed component used for the animals. We are working in prototypes in water use. We are working in animal welfare prototype too, but we have already started this process. This is just a brief review of the silvopastoral systems case studies we have been measuring. We have been doing 10 silvopastoral case studies, pilots in countries measuring this, but also we are currently dealing with other projects currently happening, like sustainable cattle ranching options, climate-smart land use, and mitigation scenarios using that model. So this is the information that I wanted to present today. Innovation, we need method. Innovation, we need tool. Innovations, we need a practice change approach to measure things on the farm level. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ernesto. Now, Liz Wedderburn will talk about the second action network of the Global Agenda, Restoring Value to Grasslands.
Thanks, Eduardo. Good morning. I'm not from Kansas, you can tell that. But they have in Manhattan the most amazing Flint Hills Discovery Center. And anybody who's interested in grasslands should go there. They have a magnificent display of the prairie and how it works. So well done, Kansas or Manhattan, it's fabulous. I'm going to ask the Action Network 2 people to stand up. There's quite a lot of us here. And so stand up, come on, it's not just me. And have a look around, people. And so these are the guys, if you want to have a chat about grasslands. We're here. I'm here en masse, so that's lovely. So thank you for the invite. So restoring value to grasslands, innovation. We've heard over the last couple of days how important conversations are and how important the whole system is. And so we've been working very hard over the last year, and we have about quite a global perspective. And we've been working hard on developing a framework that has multi-criteria for being able to assess the value from grasslands. Because we don't only get food and fibre from grasslands, and we don't only get carbon sequestration. It helps with local development, it helps with social, helps with environmental, and certainly economic. And so we've developed this framework, and we look at the grassland grazing livestock systems through these lenses. And from that, we've had 6 cases. And so the innovation itself is in the framework, but also the other key innovation is in the social process that goes with the framework, because it's only a tool to allow a conversation. It's a tool to allow people, policymakers, farmers, young people, researchers to come together and to explore what ifs. What if we do this policy? What will the impact be across all of those 4 dimensions? What happens if for succession? What do we do for there? What happens if we change the farm system? That's the innovation. We've also been able to test this framework across 6 to 8 cases globally. And there's been some amazing innovations coming out of those cases. And this is a plug, get 2 floors up, because they're in the posters up there. But we find an innovation around silvopastoral systems where natural regeneration is being a true innovation to develop those systems. With the Puna people in Argentina, the use of the framework has been really helpful in unlocking the traditional knowledge and being able to, because a lot of that knowledge has been lost, but it also is present in other South American countries. So we've been really using that traditional knowledge as a means of developing sustainable systems. The other areas we've had are been in Senegal, where we've been using the model to the framework as a simulation model to look at how the innovation there of mixing different farming types. So in the dairy system, to try to get enough volume of milk for the market, looking at small farm intensification, as well as some pastoralism. And that's been a really good innovation from that perspective. And I think the final thing from it is that the other innovations that we've been looking at are the use of this social process, simulation models, field guides to actually help guide policy. So our next stage of working is to actually really start working in close clusters in these cases to actually get some of those conversations going, because we want to find shared solutions. This is not just a farmer's issue. This is a societal issue if we really want to move forward into sustainable systems, food systems. Everyone has a stake in this game, and this type of innovation will help with that dialogue. And what it will help is people understanding the livestock grazing system and its consequences. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you, I think it's later today, in one of the sessions where we'll have some more detail. And on a Wednesday after the field day, we're hoping you can have a try with the simulation model. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Liz. We now have Caroline Emmon addressing the LEAP message. Thank you, Carol.
Good morning to all. It is indeed a privilege to chair LEAP this year on behalf of the private sector cluster. I just want to go quickly about, okay, here it is. Perfect. Just actually to mention that the Livestock Environmental Assessment Performance Partnership is in itself innovation in action. The reality is that this multi-stakeholder platform is bringing, on a consensual base, opportunity to collaborate and develop guidance and methodology. to assess the environmental footprint of food and livestock production. So we're bringing together more than 300 experts from different fields of expertise to agree and develop a methodology and a tool that would be used to help in policy development as well. We've been very prolific. Since 2012, we've developed all those guides, and it's not finished. Just imagine the amount of work and collaboration to be able to agree and develop those very, very technical methodologies. We're actually concluding right now one on water that's been expected for a long time. Leap 3 actually is in itself as well in innovation, since we've decided to pause a little bit on the development and to road test the guides that we have to make sure that they are efficient in different situations. So we're doing road testing around the world in different sectors, different realities, to make sure that the guide that we've developed are actually providing what we need. So that in itself is part of what we do in phase 3, in making sure that if they need some adjustment, we can do it before we continue to develop more guides. If you want to join LEAP, either as a member, as a road tester, because we're looking for different markets, different organizations to test road the guide, but also as a donor, you can contact actually our project manager, Camilo. Are you here, Camilo? Anyway, so if you can contact either myself or Camilo and let us know your interest. And we actually love to invite you in Rome on October 21st. We'll be launching officially phase 3 of LEAP, and that will be an opportunity of dialogue on the way to move forward. So I hope you'll have a chance to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Now, Julian Chara will present the Global Network on Silvopastoral Systems. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you, Eduardo. Good morning, everybody. It's also a privilege for me to be here sharing the information we have gathered in the Global Network on Silvopastoral Systems. The aim of this Global Network is to share information, to connect people who is working on silvopastoral systems around the globe, to find ways to scale up silvopastoral systems as a technology or as an innovation that can be help in the achievement of many of the Sustainable Development Goals. What a silvopastoral system is an arrangement of a combination of foddered plants such as grasses or leguminous herbs with shrubs and trees. But that combination has to be done proposedly. And I want to take the second definition you have there from Shibu Jose from the Missouri University, very close to here. And he says that it has to be an intentional integration with interaction and intensively management. And that's very important because it's not just a combination of trees or an introduction of trees or grasses under trees or management of timber plantation of natural forests, but it has to be intensively management, has to be integrative to take advantage of all the interactions that occur there. And I would like to add a fifth I there, which is innovation. And innovation means many things because we have found a lot of experiences of farmers using already silvopastoral systems or using trees in the systems. And there are many innovative ways of introducing the trees into a pasture system. And it's very important to find why they did it and how they succeed trying to introduce the trees in the system. And also there are many other important ways of introducing the trees in different systems. And here I want to point out one situation is that usually when you have already a grazing system or a livestock production system, you say that it's very hard to introduce a new thing there. And there's where you have to be innovative in how to do it in a way that you can continue taking advantage of that integration. So this is the countries where we have members of the Global Network on Silvopastoral Systems, and in close work with the first action network we heard this morning, the closing the efficiency gap, we have been studying these systems in several countries, several of these countries. So here I'm going to present a couple of examples of that integration. One is what happens in the northeast of Argentina with where they have 80,000 hectares of silvopastoral system that was first. It was a timber production with different species. Pine is the one that is here. And the cattle was introduced there as a way to improve cash flow and as a way to use a lot of area that was not being used. And the introduction of cattle also helped to reduce the risk of fire and to have a complete cash flow during the period. As a result, we have, with the help of the Action Network 1, have been working on how the information, the profitability of the system is. And here is what you can find is that if you introduce the animals in the system, you can, at the beginning, has a reduction in the cash flow, but then that cash flow increases, and you have a profitability along the years. Another example here of how to introduce trees, in this case, is in Mexico, where they had systems either for beef or dairy cattle with a lot of use of inputs, mainly fertilizers. And the introduction of this shrub, which is leucaena, in the system allowed them to reduce those inputs, reducing the fertilization, and increase the productivity. And this is the average profitability of the system, which at the beginning you have a negative cash flow, and then that increases a lot because of the integration of the system and the reduction in the use of inputs. And finally, a very interesting work we have been investigating or analyzing closely with the leucaena network in Australia is in Queensland, and this has 150,000 hectares of integration of leucaena. In this case, again, is to reduce the use of inputs, and they are now achieving around 50,000 hectares per year of more of this system because of the profitability they get there, and also with the reduction in the capture in the carbon. And finally, we have been working a lot in production of information and bringing all this information. Last year, we published this report in which 10 case studies of silvopastoral systems in Latin America were included. You can find it in the GASL website. And now we are working in other different ways to bring together all the information in silvopastoral systems and sharing them in different ways. From the meeting we had last year in the leucaena network in Queensland, there is just 2 numbers of the tropical grasslands journal that was on. And also we are working in the production of a book on silvopastoral systems that will include cases from all Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. Now, Brian Lindsay for Dairy Asia. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Eduardo. And as you can tell, I'm the most Asian-looking person in the room. I get the job of doing this role because Mr. Sangram Chowdhury was unable to attend, and he was going to present this. So I'll try and do him justice on this presentation this morning. I'm Brian Lindsay. I'm with the Dairy Sustainability Framework, but also a steering committee member of Dairy Asia because it is a fantastic network. So it was founded in 2014, and it was under the auspices of FAO, who brought 13 Asian countries together. And this is an incredible innovation in itself. Those of you who've worked in groups and tried to bring people together to reach consensus, by bringing 13 countries together and getting them to agree a vision for sustainable dairy in the region is incredible. Half the world's population live in these 13 countries. So we have a challenge, but we also have an exciting future. We've had a period of lull as our secretariat changed roles within FAO, but we now have a new secretariat in place, both good looks and brains as well. Martin has come to join us. He's an FAO employee, but is supported by the German government through GASL. So we're very appreciative of that, because those of you, again, who have worked in groups know the importance of having a chief driver. Someone who coordinates, keeps things moving and keeps the action going, because we are all busy in our day jobs and we want to make sure that Dairy Asia does the job. And what we're trying to do now is we're moving to a more virtual network. What we're finding in Dairy Asia is that it is more challenging for people to travel. Many of them are government employees from these countries. More challenging to get them to physical meetings, which when we do get them there, we have a fantastic meeting. This was in Myanmar last year. But we're trying new virtual approaches because with technology now in all these countries, we're able to be more interactive in the work we do. But one recurring challenge is about the Secretariat and finances for us. And as I said, we're appreciative of the German government for the auspices of Martin running the program. But we need to try and move Dairy Asia forward. It takes finances to facilitate and provide the virtual network even. And in June this year, we've actually had a proposal from one of our members to provide the Secretariat and the finances to run the Secretariat. And I think that is credit alone to Dairy Asia, and that an organisation sees the benefit of actually offering to run the Secretariat. The steering committee is currently reviewing this proposal and making sure that the Dairy Asia model can be sustainable in the future if we pursue this model, but we're very much appreciative to the country who'd offered that. Innovation. We know how difficult it is, even within country, to agree things and reach consensus. Dairy Asia, down the left-hand side here, have agreed their own sustainability framework criteria. Across 13 countries, they agreed the key criteria of what they see sustainable dairy is. But not only that, they've gone along per country and prioritised those. Now, I really like this because this map directly across to the dairy sustainability framework, which is what we want. We want to support initiatives like this. But to have those 13 countries go through the process of agreeing what they want as the criteria for sustainable dairy in their respective countries and to prioritise that criteria enables us to take the next step on deciding where our key work program should be in supporting these countries in delivering those priorities. And just as an example of innovation at the level we're at Dairy Asia, we run Dairy Asia Sustainability Awards. So 13 countries, members of Dairy Asia, we had 21 applications of sustainability activities in Myanmar where we voted, the members actually voted the winner. And the winner was actually from India, and I would like to share with you just what they are sharing with the other members of Dairy Asia, what they're doing in India. And this is all to do with animal feeding. And you can read here, 2/3 of animals fed in excess of requirements, similar number are deficient in essential minerals, ration planning and local feeds, training locals deliverers to provide advice. That was crucial. There wasn't that local advice that farmers could take advantage of to feed their animals appropriately. And what they did is they tagged the animals so they could monitor them all the way through. And just in terms of scale, and one of my take-home messages from yesterday's presentation is about how do we achieve this change at scale, because that's where we have our real impact as livestock agriculture. And here alone, this project, 2.4 million animals, 30,000 villages, and 1.8 million farmers, of 25% were women. But the outcomes were pretty key. Increase of income for those farmers. They increased the milk production, and that's more milk for families, not just for sale. They had reduced feeding costs by focusing on what was locally available. They built the rationing program, the National Dairy Development Board of India, they built the rationing program that accommodated the local feeds available to those farmers, but put them together in a balanced way. They decreased greenhouse gas emissions by 12 to 15%, which is incredible on that scale. And the social status of the people who are doing the advising was increased within the communities. So that's just a couple of examples of what Dairy Asia is doing. We are looking forward to a more exciting and virtual network that we're now running with these 13 Asian countries and moving more from the talking and sharing into the implementing like we've just seen happening in India and the sharing of those methodologies. Thank you.
Many thanks, Brian. The Livestock Antimicrobial Partnership presented by Ulf Magnusson. Thank you, Ulf.
Good morning, everyone. We who travel long distance, we start to recover from the jet lag, more or less. And there's a good, for those of you who are in the same situation as me, it's a very good coffee shop where you can get strong espressos, double espresso. And I don't have any stock or interest in that shop, so it was just an observation. Well, the instruction here was for me to have one slide, so I just have one slide. It's not by laziness, it's just following instructions. The Livestock Antimicrobial Partnership, we address antimicrobial resistance by supporting healthy and productive livestock. This is important. It's not a banning organization or something like that. We really want to promote healthy and productive livestock, I think, to make that very clear. Our approach is to collect good practices all over the world from different farming systems, from different regions, and put these together and synthesize and extract the good things and then sharing. So that is the leverage, or the innovative aspect, is to move the good practices where there are bad practices, if I put it simply. And we had our first good practices pamphlet made this summer. We had a meeting in Brussels at the IDF headquarters. We were a group from Royal Veterinary College in the UK, from International Dairy Federation, from International Poultry Council, and also from Vétérinaires Sans Frontières International, and myself. Our university, Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, are hosting this network. And it's indeed room for expansion, and it's room for improvement in this one. So we will have a meeting in this open space things at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I will announce the room number. That is not cleared yet. But you're most welcome, and ask for to come there if you are interested in this field, so we can continue this conversation. In this particular one, we looked into 3 farming systems, we could say. One is small-scale livestock production in sub-Saharan Africa. There are extremely, if I put it like that, scattered or weak data. It's more identification of issues or challenges. And that is also to balance this view on antimicrobial resistance, that there are tremendous differences all over the world. The second one is on poultry production systems in high-income countries. We show how both in UK, the Netherlands, and France, the use of antibiotics in the sector has reduced tremendously over the last some 5 years. And then finally, we are dealing with mastitis, a specific disease then, and not only a dairy system, but that particular disease. And it's examples from the Netherlands, from Sweden, and also from India. So this is what we have done. But I ask you you're most welcome to come at 3 p.m. somewhere to discuss this further, because we are indeed keen to collect more practices so we can share. And also on, let's see, this website here, we have, our university is running a massive open online course that is currently open. In the first run, we had participants from 151 countries all over the world. I think that is an achievement. It's called Effective Livestock Production with Low Use of Antibiotics. So you can, there's still some weeks you can join that. It's a free one. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ulf. Now Ernesto Reyes will refer to the Livestock for Social Development Action Network. Thanks, Ernesto. He has some extra time because he has to give you another message too.
Okay, thank you. Now, listen, the work that we are going to present in the Action Network, Livestock for Social Development, is a paper, an advanced paper that is still under discussions of the relationship between dairy and reducing animal hungry. Let's start that this work has been carried out by several institutions, and the main two working areas of this action network is to provide evidence, and evidence is these publications. And second, we're also working on data impact methodology that we have been discussing this morning and yesterday during the parallel sessions, these methodologies. This work has been carried out by the organizations like the Global Agenda, the FAO, the Global Data Platform, IFCN Data Network. The main idea of this series of publications as paper was to have a rigorously academic approach of finding the links between data and social SDGs. It was the first task of this, and we have been able to produce a publication that was launched recently in Mongolia last year, which is the link between data development's impact and poverty reductions. This publication is already available in the website of the Global Agenda, if you want to have a look. And from this, we have been able to demonstrate through a meta-analysis, a research review, that data development makes a significant contributions to poverty reductions, two levels, community and household level. For household level, we have been measuring the increase in milk consumption and nutrition, the increase in revenues, the impact of data in increasing the revenue, and the food security with additional crop yields and employment generation at on-farm level. At the community level, we have been able to demonstrate throughout this meta-analysis that there are several studies demonstrating the impact of data in generating income through milk collection and distribution, employment through milk collection and processing, employment generations at the different sector and subsector. And the core element, the multiplier effect can data have in a community of this. Just to end it up with the story that dairy cow ownership and improvement on cows' productions had a substantial positive impact on household welfare. Now, we are going to present, we are still in draft discussions of data development impact on reducing global hunger. And this is very much a link with the discussions we had yesterday morning about in diets, nutrition, sustainable diets. I would like to remark this. So let's have a review how this work is still carried out. The review, the scope of this study has been to evaluate the evidence as a positive and causal relationship between ownership of dairy animals, milk dairy consumption, and child growth. We have been reducing only to measure this in low and middle income countries. And the methodological approach we have been using for this was to have observational trials and observational studies. And we were selecting papers from the last 20 years, from the scientific literature, fulfilling the following requirements. Only original works, excluding reviews, that has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, or papers that has been presented in conference proceedings, and that has been carried out in low and middle income countries involving children up to 19 years, and reporting anthropometric measurements, and quantified dairy consumption, and the most important things, two main facts behind: statistical analysis, randomized control trials or control groups to compare the impact of this. The results, what is the evidence telling us at this stage of this work? Studies provide strong evidence, as we have been proven with the poverty paper, that in rural low-income settings, household milk production increased household milk consumption, and therefore, that increase in milk consumption result in improved child linear growth and reduced stunting. This is the evidence was telling us. So, we were just measuring two main topics: dairy consumption and child growth, and cow ownership and child growth. In both cases, we have been measuring two types of analysis: interventional trials and observational studies. The same for the second group of analysis. And For interventional trials, the studies have been reporting height gain during a time period providing protein from milk, supplementation, and measuring height. And in all these cases, this was also a cumulative difference. Also, we have been able to show, or these studies have been able to demonstrate, that there is a positive association between dairy consumption and height gain, monthly and cumulative. The same work has been demonstrated for weight gain. A positive relationship again. Coming back to observational studies, there are several countries involved in this analysis. Latin American countries, MENA countries, Southeast Asia, West Africa, East Africa, and all these studies, these are the authors, were reporting that through dairy consumption, they were measuring stunting, height, and weight. And those reports that were measuring stunting, the stunting has been reduced. Those studies that has been measuring height, in most of the cases, height has been increased as well as weight. So this with the observational studies. Now let's go to what will happen if we have a cow. This is mainly results from a study that has been conducted by Heifer International Dairy Cow Ownership Program, demonstrating of selecting 43 children up to 5 years, receiving a pregnant cow, compared to 56 children up to 5 years, not having a cow. That has been the study that has been conducted. And they have found a positive higher association between height and weight, those children with a pregnant cow program after that. If we go to observational studies, again, the similar approach, comparing with dairy, with no dairy, with cow, with no cows, we have been looking at that, again, stunting in the cases that has been measured has been reduced, as well as weight and height. This has more or less the studies have demonstrated. Final remarks of these studies. Cow ownership increased the likelihood of higher milk intakes. We have been able to demonstrate this through this meta-analysis report, following a rigorous academic approach on this. Second, milk consumption at the household level was positively associated with higher child growth. Consumption of dairy products in low-income households was associated with reduced stunting, underweight, and wasting. And I just want to end it up that through these processes of demonstrating the impact on dairy, on the social SDGs, with the first two that we have conducted, dairy development can thus be considered a useful instrument in the quest to achieve SDG 2, but also we have been able to demonstrate that dairy is able to simultaneously supporting SDG 1 on poverty reduction. I just want to thank you to the people that have been able to do so, the teams in the FIO, the teams in the IFCN, the teams with the Global Dairy Platform conducting this, but also I would like to thank you, the editorial committee of GASL, that has been able to, in a neutral process, to take these publications, to start reviewing these publications, and to approve the advances and the draft proposal that has been held for this. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ernesto. And now Valentina Riva from the Animal Welfare Action Network. Thanks, Valentina.
Good morning. I'm the last, am I? So that then less than 5 minutes of me, and then you're free to go to the great coffee place I've mentioned to join some good coffee. My name is Valentina Riva. I work for the Donkey Sanctuary, and I'm here to present the Action Network on Animal Welfare Highlights and Innovation on behalf of Dr. Rebecca Doyle, who's the chair of the network. The integration of livestock welfare is a growing expectation in our society. So it is now globally and universally accepted that high animal welfare standards improve and contribute significantly to food, nutrition, and above all, the productivity and resilience of livestock systems. For that reason, a global agenda action network on animal welfare was established in 2017, and that itself was an innovation. After a period of radio silence, the network resumed its work with the new chairmanship under Dr. Doyle, and it has now a finalized agenda and strategy and a plan running between 2019 and 2021. These are the current members of the network, whose overarching purpose is to showcase how animal welfare directly delivers for development and help in delivering the SDGs in line with the global agenda selected priorities. To reach that goal, we are developing a hub of expertise that can advise on solutions and implementation of best practices. And at the same time, we are actively promoting visibility and communication on animal welfare-related policies and practices. These are the immediate projects we are currently undertaking. So we are developing target publications on the relationship between animal welfare and interlinkages with animal welfare and the SDGs. And we are actively identifying case studies to show how this works in practice. At the same time, we are promoting the use of animal welfare indicators, evidence-based animal welfare indicators, and we see there are clear links between what we do and our network works and groups. And we would like to build connections to share resources and obviously to maximize our impact. As an example of progress we've made so far, we've been mapping SDGs and animal welfare, and we have identified clear links between animal welfare and how it can achieve a number of SDGs. We presented this work in different ways and to several audiences. So for instance, Dr. Doyle presented this piece of work recently in Hong Kong and Australia. And as an additional example, the International Coalition for Working Equids prepared a brochure in which they identified 9 SDGs and gave a specific example on how animal welfare relates to these. The next step of the Action Network is now to gather all the evidence and obviously continue collecting more evidence, and to gather all the content in a background paper or a published review. So to conclude, in essence, the essence of the Animal Welfare Action Network is to prove the point that animal welfare is an essential and integral part of livestock and production systems, regardless of the production scale, the animal species, or the farm size. So we, as a network, will continue promoting and driving this idea, at the same time advocating and promoting policy and practice change. So if any other groups and network are interested in joining forces, you're very welcome. Please contact me or Dr. Doyle. And if you want to hear more specific cases on how animal welfare delivers for development, make sure that you attend this afternoon session J, in which you will hear presentations and projects from the International Dairy Federation and the Donkey Sanctuary. Thank you.
Many thanks to Valentina. I hope you have appreciated that behind each action network there is a champion, a research institution that makes their operation possible. Action networks are mostly self-sustained, so although many GASL members have joined them and are working with them, also non-GASL members can join them and work with them. So you are welcome to get more information and to get in touch with our action networks if you are interested in joining and supporting any of them. So many thanks for your attention. Now back to Susan for the next session.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thanks to our Action Network representatives. If what you heard this morning from them piqued your curiosity about the global agenda for sustainable livestock, and you would like to learn more about the organization and how you might be more active in it in the future, we invite you to join us for breakfast on Thursday morning at 7 o'clock. It'll be in this building in the K-State Ballroom upstairs. All are welcome to attend. It's an open invitation for anybody that's interested in learning more about the organization. I also want to mention, if you are heading back to the Kansas City Airport and need transportation on Friday, we will offer a 54-passenger motor coach to make that transport. If you are interested, there's a sign-up sheet at the registration desk. And next, we will hear from Dr. Alan Featherstone, who is the department head of agricultural economics here at Kansas State University. So those who attended the session yesterday know that we had 4 plenary sessions across those sustainability domains of food and nutrition security, animal health and welfare, climate and natural resources, and livelihood and economic growth. And so Alan's going to provide us just a quick summary of what we heard yesterday, and also just a bit of reflection and key takeaways. So, Dr. Featherstone.
Thanks, Susan. And so what I'm going to do in the time that I have, and it's always dangerous giving an economist this much time, simply because we can sometimes talk forever. But essentially I'm going to essentially provide a summary and some reflections across the 4 summary domains. And in some respects, I think I would encourage you all to read the papers that were developed around each of these sustainability domains. In some respects, they just bring out across the idea that these are all interrelated. And so it's very difficult, and as you read the papers, you very quickly realize that you can't really separate them out in terms of there is that interconnectedness that really, I think, drives the system forward. And so yesterday we had a session on food and nutrition security. We had a session on livelihoods and economic growth. We had a session on animal health and animal welfare. And we had a session on climate and natural resource use. Before I begin, I would like to thank some of those that have helped me prepare these comments. There were a number of individuals from the Agricultural Communications Department that were providing some summaries in that as the sessions were going on, such that we're able to cross-link the ideas with the slides and the papers. And so what I'm going to do, at least initially, is just summarize a discussion of what we learned yesterday. And so this is kind of the quick version of essentially 6-7 hours of presentations from yesterday. In terms of, we learned from the Food and Nutritional Security Panel that livestock does provide an important source of nutrition globally. And in some respects, it does deliver those nutritionally rich foods, and it is going to be a solution to malnutrition across the globe. And so if you're going to try to solve malnutrition just by a plant-based type system, sometimes that isn't going to be all that is needed. The other thing that was brought out in the discussion was the issue of food security, and they provided a definition from the UN Committee on World Food Security. And the definition they provided is this is a condition in which all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And certainly there's a lot in this definition that an economist can like. In terms of, certainly it does talk about the need for economic access, but in some respects probably it gets more fundamental when it begins to talk about preferences. And we're really going to talk and come back and drill down on the idea of preferences. In terms of because there are different preferences around the globe, essentially there is going to be a need for a multidimensional approach to sustainable livestock systems. In fact, as you sat in some of the sessions yesterday, there was a discussion with regards to diversity of systems and the diversity of approaches to essentially meet those food needs that are currently there, and in some respects that will continue to grow as time goes on. Household food insecurity, we learned yesterday, has important impacts on maternal and child nutrition. In terms of, and this was alluded to a little bit this morning, it does affect child mortality, it affects their IQ scores, it affects the income and the overall GDP of countries. And so food and nutrition security not only is the right thing to do from a moral imperative, it's also the right thing to do from an economic imperative. In terms of, there was discussion yesterday that source foods are essential for improving the infant and young child nutrition. For example, eggs provide more than 25% of a baby's needs for energy. The confounding fact there is that the poorer the country, the higher the cost of those foods. The other thing that I think is important to realize is that there is the whole issue of sustainability of livestock production based on the uses of natural resources and greenhouse emission concerns. And so there's that balancing that was brought out in that first session yesterday with regards to the benefit of nutrition versus some of the concerns with regards to environmental impacts. Certainly, I think technology is being developed to reduce that natural resource use, and it's being deployed in many different situations, and we learned about some of those yesterday, and even this morning in the first comments, we learned about how some of that technology is being deployed and is ready to be scaled up in order to essentially begin to address some of those negative externalities associated with livestock production. There was discussion yesterday with the whole issue of traceability, and the key there is being able to provide information up and down the supply chain. It is important from a consumer perspective that they understand the processes used to produce that food and just how that food moved from the producer to the consumer. Conversely, it's very important for the producer to understand the consumer preferences in terms of, is there information that can move back? And in some respects, this is a very data-intensive type aspect when you consider the amount of meat products that we do consume and produce on a daily basis, just to provide that information along the supply chain such that people can better respond to preferences and better understand the technologies used to produce the food that is on their plate. There also is the important discussion with regards to the fact that animals do create or convert inedible resources into functional foods. In terms of, there's a lot of things on the planet that a human cannot consume directly, and so that is one of the benefits in terms of using that livestock or using those inedible resources much more efficiently. There was work yesterday presented that suggested that the use of livestock to maintain rangelands actually improves the efficiency of those aspects. There also was quite a bit of discussion with regards to means of increased efficiency in production. In terms of the whole aspect there would be being able to sex chicken eggs before they hatch and essentially separate the chain for those that are going to go into the layer stream versus those that could just be processed and used as eggs. And so there is an aspect of technology there that is very important. Then we concluded, or the discussion concluded just with a discussion of the multifaceted approach needed in Africa to achieve their zero hunger goals by 2030, and certainly animal-sourced foods was going to be a component of that. We next moved to a discussion of livelihoods and economic growth. In terms of the one of the statements that was made early on was that livestock production brings economic freedom, sustainability, and a higher quality of life to producers, consumers, and their families in many parts of the world. There's the whole discussion with regards to the value addition to crop production, whether or not that be grasses, whether or not that be grains. Certainly livestock in many places of the world provide a store of wealth upon which individuals have a means to make their wealth move from period to period in those situations where the banking system or other financial systems have not developed to an important level. In terms of, there was discussion with regards to the whole effect that humane as well as efficient are important in terms of, there's a lot of research out there indicating that if you're not humanely treating livestock, they're not going to be efficient. And again, that's certainly an impact with regards to the livelihoods. The other thing is that innovation is transforming livestock systems. What we did yesterday is no longer efficient today simply because of that innovation. And what we do 5 years from now, when they look back at what we say is efficient today, they'll probably end up laughing at us in terms of kind of saying, in terms of they thought that was efficient, but there's new technology, whether or not be a gradual technology or disruptive technology to transform those systems. Sustainability and innovation are important global issues. There was a wide discussion with regards to the dairy industry, examples provided all the way from a robotic type milking system to a very labor intensive system where essentially there's no technology. And in some respects, those coexist in order to feed a hungry world. In terms of, there was also discussion in terms of mechanisms out there where greenhouse gases can be reduced. Again, as I indicated, as you go through these papers and as you go through the discussions yesterday, certainly there is that aspect of cross-cutting themes in terms of antimicrobial resistance is really important in economic efficiency. Certainly it's important from a disease perspective and pandemics, as we learned later in the day, but it also has an economic aspect to that. There were examples and innovations with regards to dealing with mastitis and dairy production in India. There was a case study of looking at the mortality in backyard chicken production due to a reduction in diarrhea. And then there was some work on trying to reduce abortions in ewes. And certainly those were all examples of dealing with that issue of antimicrobial resistance and essentially using that to begin to deal and improve economic efficiency. The big thing also that came out, and this is a theme I think that needs to continue to go, and in some respects, this was looking at dissemination of information through technology. And the concept or the context of this was essentially taking what we've learned and pushing it back to the producers. I think the other thing, though, that we really need to think about as individuals involved in livestock systems is pushing the information the other way, disseminating information through technology to our end consumers. Ultimately, they end up forming those consumer preferences, and education and information can be very useful as they think about those preference formation process. And so that's one of the things that I will also come back to a little bit later in my comments with regards to the whole issue of communication. The fact that it's our responsibility to essentially get involved in the communication aspect. as an economist, as a scientist, many times I just like to communicate to fellow researchers and talk with my acronyms and in those aspects. But in terms of from a policy process, that's not that effective. From a societal change aspect, that's not that successful. And so certainly dissemination of information through technology, both back to the producer all the way through the consumer, I think is really one of the goals, and I think one of the challenges as we walk away from this conference in terms of how do we provide information in a way that is accessible. Again, I'm in the classroom, and if you look at how students learn, they learn very differently than I did. And essentially, they don't want to memorize anything simply because they have their phone access to the internet. They'll look up the answer. Sometimes you worry in terms of the accuracy of where they're looking up those answers, but it's very different in terms of memorization from an academic perspective is one of the things that I no longer emphasize. I've totally de-emphasized it because of the power of technology that individuals hold in their hand. And in some respects, I think we need to figure out a way as scientists to better communicate that information. There was also a discussion with regards to innovation through the silvopastoral systems, amazing things with regards to soil recovery, biodiversity in terms of using trees and forests and grazing all together. We had some discussion of that this morning. Certainly there's animal welfare aspects to that. They were able to see reduced methane emissions. It did create jobs and provided economic opportunity. And certainly that is going to be important as we move forward, is essentially providing that economic opportunity, providing those jobs to those that may not be directly involved in production, but throughout the food supply chain. And then finally, there was the discussion that while this was maybe not an intended outcome, it was certainly a positive side benefit with regards to the organic production of milk that essentially allows that output to enter a different part of a supply chain in a niche way to satisfy those that have preferences for organic production. In the afternoon, we began with animal health and animal welfare. Essentially, the thing is they dramatically brought out that it does relate to the other three dimensions, the fact that you can't look at those aspects individual. There were 5 aspects that they ended up looking at: the impact of animal disease, zoonosis and pandemics, foodborne diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and animal welfare. One of the things I think that we're all well aware of is those transboundary animal diseases certainly can be devastating in terms of as they move across the world in terms of one location to the other. Certainly there are devastating aspects, and anything we can do to reduce those certainly will benefit humanity. The other thing is those zoonosis and pandemics is the case where those diseases essentially move from animal to human and human to animal and back and forth. In some respects, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the campus, but essentially the whole NBAF facility that's going up north of campus is essentially built to address those diseases. Those, in some respects, are the most difficult diseases. They're the most sometimes pathogenic. And so basically being able to address those and determine how we work through those and prevent those if they from occurring, and if they do occur, how do you treat those is very important. And certainly with all of these, I think it's very important that while this is much more of a hard science aspect, I think it's very important also to consider the consumer dimension of these. The reason I say that is we can invent a technology that the consumers are turned off by. And in some respects, I think as we're looking at the science in order to treat these things, I think there also needs to be some consideration in terms of consumer acceptance. I think it's very important as we look at these. Foodborne diseases, a huge issue in terms of, I've had some limited opportunities to travel abroad, and one of the things that many times when you're talking to government officials, one of the problems that is most vexing is being able to treat those foodborne diseases. There's just so much lost in terms of human productivity because of those diseases. And certainly that was touched on with regards to the animal health and welfare section and just the need to have that rapid response. And then I'm going to skip over antimicrobial resistance. I've covered that kind of in the livelihood aspect, but animal welfare, again, it has a major effect on consumer behavior and preferences. And so again, there is an efficiency aspect to that, but this paper, I think, rightly pointed out that there is an important effect on consumer behavior and preferences. If society does not like how we're treating our livestock animals, that really can create major disruptions with regards to going forward. One of the issues that was brought out in kind of the response was just the whole issue that in many parts of the world, regulations are not in place, and if they are, they're not enforced. And again, this is kind of a policy response thing, I think, that is very important, that if there are regulations with regards to animal health related issues, they need to be in place. And so if they're not there, they need to be formed. And if they are there, they need to be enforced. In terms of essentially having a regulation, and I learned this very quickly with my children, having regulations with no enforcement is no regulation. In terms of very quickly, they learn to get around that, and in some respects, I think many times I'm in a worse situation as a parent than having no regulations at all. And so it is very important that there is that enforcement mechanism there in order to enforce those regulations. There was a very elusive point in terms of, can the cure be worse than the disease? And this is the whole issue with regards to consumer preferences. For example, the whole consumer reaction to foot and mouth disease in the UK. The whole issue with regards to African swine fever, and in some respects, I'm not sure we know the boundaries of that disease or even what the response will be. But certainly, I think that's one of the things to think about, is that as we think about cures, we do need to make sure that they're not worse than the disease in and of itself. There was a excellent session talking about farmers assuring responsible management, the acronym FARM. Again, this was a framework for essentially providing that on-farm animal care, the aspect of continuous improvement, the idea that it's outcomes-based, the fact that you do need to see those results. It is science-based, and there is the aspect in there for the producer to monitor that, but also there needs to be some type of producer monitoring from time to time, certainly to make sure that the system is working correctly. The thing is what they were trying to look at, and it's a great example, and so I would encourage you to review those presentations if you happen to miss them. But the entire supply chain is addressed through animal care, antibiotic stewardship, environmental stewardship, and also the aspect of workforce development. There was also some discussion with regards to developing a surveillance system for antimicrobial resistance. The case study here was the Caribbean and Latin America, focus on the poultry sector, but essentially what's very interesting there is they did develop a 16-step tool to meet those performance goals, and probably what's most impressive is the fact that it has been implemented in 10 countries. And so this may be a model in order to address those issues, and certainly understanding how that was put together, what those 16 steps tool is to meet those goals, I think is very worthy. Then there was the healthy animals, healthy people, healthy environment. Disease prevention is just not limited to food animals. It was brought to our attention the need to look at other animals that are non-food animals simply because there can be some disease transmission from those animals to the food animal network. And essentially the discussion revolved around rabies yesterday. Animal health services data in Africa is not always reliable, and I would say animal health services probably in the U.S. is probably not always reliable. And so this isn't probably a unique situation, but I think it does draw the attention to the fact that data continues to be important. And in some respects, as we move forward in the livestock sector, I think we're going to see more data, more need of data than less. And again, there are concerns with regards to the lack of communication abilities and the level of scientific background. I think that again goes back to communication. Are there ways that we can communicate to those producers that do not have the ability to read? Are we able to communicate the scientific information necessary to those that don't have the scientific background? Again, while it was in the context of Africa, in some respects, I think certainly the lack of scientific background is vexing in many parts of the world. In terms of, I think in some respects, the level of our scientific background, because of the quickness in the advancement of science, has maybe outstripped the ability for the lay person that is not involved in science activity to really understand how that has changed so quickly. Even if they did have that background at one point, they may not have kept up with what those changes are and what those implications of that is. That leads to the last session that we took a look at yesterday, and that's the issue of climate and natural resource use. In terms of, again, the hypothesis that the paper started off with was that livestock production converts a huge amounts of biomass into food production. Diversity of resources can be used. There's the whole discussion with regards to biomass versus grains in terms of what is the trade-off in terms of the effect on the natural resource base and the climate. Again, there was information provided in that working paper with regards to trade-off with methane production. They pointed to the fact that grasslands many times are healthier if they're grazed. There is that whole crop livestock interaction that is especially important in smallholder production in terms of essentially in a smallholder environment, certainly that interaction can be fairly important. Moving towards more intensive systems can lead to a disruption of nutrient cycles, and certainly that is one of the issues in confined animal feeding that does need to be taken into account in terms of how can we begin to re-put together that nutrient cycle. Innovations with efficiency, and again, there's innovations that will decrease emission intensity. They talked about the circular method, the using offsets and alternatives. But the whole thing I think that was important is there is important work beginning to look at how technology and thought processes can begin to reduce that natural resource and environmental footprint. Certainly there are concerns with the climate effects due to intensive systems. One of the things that they brought out is that consumers need to be able to make the choice. In order for consumers to be able to make the choice, they need to have the information. And certainly that information needs to be communicated, or otherwise the sector, again, can be vulnerable. In terms of, again, in terms of economics, essentially, we like to use the term rationality. Rationality basically means that the consumers have the information at their fingertips and they go out and use it. I'm not sure that rationality is where we are in a world in terms of there's so much information at people's fingertips. Sometimes they're just throw up their hands in the air and kind of say, you know, I'm going to find out what's going on social media, and that's how I'm going to end up making our decision. And so certainly that communication is important. We had the example of High Plains Feed Yard, again, a fairly large livestock-intensive feeding system. They have a strong focus on water conservation, limited irrigation, genetic selection of cattle basis on feed conversion. Certainly there's probably some humanitarian goals there, but there's also an economic goal there in terms of essentially by using water better, by limiting your irrigation, by doing better selection of cattle basis, there also is that profit motive tied into the environmental motive. Looking at changing corn to sorghum, again, sorghum uses less water, and so there is looking at ways to essentially produce that feed using less water. A lot of discussion with regards to limited use of pharmaceuticals. Again, trying to determine whether or not pharmaceuticals are used based upon animal behavior. And so it's diagnose, then treat, as opposed to treat and not worry about diagnosing. And certainly, I think losing some of the, lessening some of the use of pharmaceuticals certainly will have impacts on antimicrobial use. The other thing I think that's very important is data-driven management. In terms of, as you look at where the agricultural industry is going, at least in the US, it's going to be much more data-driven. In terms of producers do want that data, and they want to know how to use that data to make those types of economic decisions. We saw some innovation in Uruguay, basically a grass-fed based system that looks at traceability, limiting growth home promoters are prohibited there. Essentially, they found that they were able to adjust greenhouse gas emissions with some of those mitigation targets. We finished yesterday with the discussion with regards to the need for sustainable food production. Certainly that there's that Lancet report in looking at the rebalancing of the plate such that fruits and vegetables are more of the center as opposed to meat. Certainly there are technologies in terms of providing new feed via using microbial production protein from sewage and other waste. And again, one of the things I think we would really need to think about there is consumer acceptance. In terms of, I'm not sure in terms of what the consumer acceptance would be eating animal protein, milk, eggs, dairy from feed produced from sewage. In terms of there would need to be a pretty good educational type process there in order to, I think, get that consumer acceptance. There also was a discussion that it may be expensive in the beginning, but prices may come down. And so again, I think that was kind of the summary that we had yesterday. I'm going to move into maybe some of my thoughts with regards to as we move to the policy day. And a couple of the big discussions revolve around innovation and trade. And if we really think of yesterday, I think we had some really outstanding examples of innovation. In terms of if I would have to critique some of the discussion we had yesterday, I think it was probably a little bit less on the trade side. In terms of I'm just not sure that we have really addressed that and really wrestled with that issue, and it's going to have some important impacts with regards to even location of economic activity. In terms of if you take given that there's going to be a demand for animal product, and if you take for given that at least part of it is going to be in a grain-fed system, I think there's going to be societal issues in terms of are we going to transport the grain or are we going to transport the livestock, and what are the environmental aspects of looking at grain versus livestock transportation. One of the things that we talk about a lot with regards to sustainable is there's three definitions that are commonly used: the ability to use without completely using up or destroying, involving methods that do not completely use or destroy natural resources, or the ability to continue for a long time. In terms of, I view sustainability a little bit differently, and part of it is from my farm background in terms of a long time ago, I grew up on a dairy farm in southeastern Wisconsin. It was your 30-cow dairy farm that was fairly typical of Wisconsin at that point in time. And one of the things that I think really helped and really helps my understanding is the sustainability is a journey rather than a destination. In terms of back when I was growing up, there was a lot of discussion with regards to sustainability. What we were calling sustainability then, we would laugh at now with regards to sustainability. And so in some respects, sometimes I think there's a frustration that we don't get to this elusive goal of sustainability. But in some respects, I think it's a journey rather than a destination. And there was some discussion with regards to optimality there, and as an economist, I can begin to think about an optimality, and when I was putting my thoughts together last night, I was tempted to throw up an equation, but I decided to spare you of an equation because economists love equations. But I think it's really important to realize that optimality also is a moving target. In terms of optimality is going to be dependent on the technology that is available there, and science is going to push that technology out. In terms of, I think economists in the room certainly are familiar with Solo's technology change. Essentially, we have time period 1, the lower period, time period 2, the more recent time period, and essentially we have our output on the y-axis and we have our capital or labor. We can either use labor or capital in a two-input system on the x-axis. The key thing to realize is that what was efficient in 1980 when I was a sophomore in college on the family dairy farm, that technology is no longer efficient. In terms of the rations are much better, in terms of there's all kinds of technology, and so essentially we're able to get more output with less input than we previously had. And so I think it is important also because technology is dynamic. I think our choice of optimality is also going to continue to change. What I did here in a paper that was published in Applied Economic Perspectives and Policy is I looked at basically from 1961 to 2014 using the FAO stat crop data and livestock data, and I looked at the annual change in unit of output per a unit of input. For maize, soybean, wheat, and rice, essentially that was an acre or a hectare of land. For beef, it was pounds of beef per animal, pounds of chicken per animal, pounds of pork per animal, and pounds of milk per animal. And so essentially what this indicates is it basically just looks at from a global perspective on a world. Essentially each year we're getting about 2% more output from maize than the previous year. 1.5% on soybeans, 2% on wheat, 1.7% on rice. Beef about 0.6%. Chicken, 0.7%, 0.3% on pork, 0.57% on milk. And again, my economist friends sometimes beat me up about this because I don't have input change, and I agree I don't have input change, but I don't really have good economic data in terms of what the input's there to dissect what actually is technological progress versus what is input use. But I think in some respects, I think you can look through these and see that there are very differential effects across the globe. And in some respects, some regions have seen major growth in those periods of time, others haven't. The key thing I think to realize is that the evidence basically does support the idea that that production function is being pushed out, that we are going to a higher level of progress. In terms of looking at this from an economist's perspective, one of the things we think about in terms of supply is productivity. Can we get more out of the resources we're using? The other aspect is essentially the land area. and we'll see if this works.
The focus of President Goodluck Ebele Jonathan for the Nigerian economy is really to transform the economy by diversifying it away from oil. And we're doing that by focusing on several key sectors. Agriculture is a key sector where we have a lot of opportunity because most of our arable land is not used.
Our priority has to be first and foremost to use our population to eat what we produce a lot of food for ourselves, reduce our dependency on import of food, to use agriculture to create jobs. Agriculture is central to our economic transformation agenda.
The part of country where I'm from, which is the north, we're very rich in agriculture.
The northern Guinea savanna of Nigeria, let us see to our amazement, is just exactly like the savannas of Brazil. Cerrados of Brazil account for 75% of all the export of Brazil. And so our determination as a government is to take that potential that we have in the northern Guinea savanna and to unlock it. We've got in Nigeria 85 million hectares of land, of which no more than 40% of which is utilized. We've got the water, we've got the labor, we've got great sunshine, we've got hardworking people. What we've got to do is to unlock that potential. The president just launched a program which is called Nigerian Agricultural Entrepreneurs, or what is called Nagropreneurs. That plan is to produce about 760,000 young graduates that are going to be in agriculture as a business, as Nagropreneurs as we call them. And each one of them will employ about 10 people. And so that tells you that about 7 million jobs can be easily created that way. The president was very clear. We're going to run agriculture as a business. The economic revival of northern Nigeria obviously does not depend on oil. It depends on agriculture, but agriculture as a business.
I like using that example for a couple of reasons. One, Hakeem did win the World Food Prize. He also happened to be a contemporary of mine when I was going to graduate school, and so I got to know him when he was a graduate student. But in terms of if you listen to what he said, and again, this is 5 years out of date. He's now president of the African Development Bank, but essentially he's looking at converting and essentially replicating the Brazilian experience in Africa. And his argument is that they're using about 40% of 85 million hectares. And essentially, if you can move that from 40 to 45 million, essentially that would be a doubling of the land being used. Essentially, what this would move is it would move Nigeria from being essentially the 7th or 8th largest agricultural country in the world to about 5th. And so in some respects, there is that potential there. And in some respects, I think that is kind of the dual system in terms of looking at, in terms of when you talk about replicating the Brazilian experience, it's probably not going to be the smallholder experience. It's probably going to be fairly modern, high science, high technology type agriculture, which has been adopted within Brazil. In terms of looking at this, and one of the ways I want to think about this is essentially what I've plotted here is essentially the world population from 1950 to about where we are now. And so this is what many of us have dealt with regards to our career. And this is a cartogram, and so basically what it indicates is as the size of the continent gets larger, population density is increasing. As the area gets smaller, basically that means on a relative basis population density is there. And then you have the different deepening shades of purple to represent bigger and more population. In terms of looking at that, one of the things you can certainly see is just the importance of Asia. You can see the beginning of the increase in the importance of Africa. You can see a decrease in the relative importance of Europe, South America, and North America. If we look at what our current students or those that are getting ready to graduate now are going to deal with. They're going to be dealing with a world that essentially is moving over the next 30 years, and one of the things you can't help but notice is just the explosion of population in Africa. Certainly there is some increase in Asia, but if you look at Asia as a whole, it's becoming less and less important compared to Africa. In terms of, in some respects, what makes this most disturbing is given the impact, or given where we are from a food security perspective now, where are the most issues that we have? Most of the issues, or most of the acute issues, are in Africa. And so essentially we're adding a huge amount of population into a region that already has fairly severe issues. And then if we go on to our grandkids' world, essentially using the UN population projections, I think it's just astounding in terms of where the attention needs to be. In terms of Africa, just continues to end up growing. Asia becomes less and less important. Europe becomes less important. The US and North America becomes less important. South America becomes less important with regards to a population. And so certainly as we move forward, one of the things that we need to prepare for is feeding Africa. In terms of looking at this, essentially over the next 30 years, we're going to add 2 billion people. Roughly 700 million of those will be in Asia. Roughly 1.2 billion of those are going to be in Africa. We're essentially going to be doubling this in just the next 50 years, and if you go further, it's going to begin to increase even more than that. The other thing I think that is important, and I like to tell my students about, is a lot of times there's a lot of issues with regards to China right now. There's the trade issues, there's just the concern with regards to that. But if you believe the populations, and if they bear out in 2024, India will be the most populous country in the world. And so certainly I think there's going to be need issues with regards to India and just their food issues in terms of they're less secure than certain regions. As an economist, there's two things that create demand. One is people, the other is income. What I have here is I have information from the FAO that kind of looks at the GDP per capita. I have it in constant dollars to try to take that out there. One of the things you'll ask me is what happened to the Europe in terms of around the 1990s. My guess is it's a data error, and so I'm not exactly sure what's going on there with regards to how Europe is, but you're going to see kind of what's going on in some of the graphs. One of the things I think that it's important to realize is just what have people done as they become more wealthy. And what I've plotted here, and I have information for just broad continents, in terms of I plot the world, Africa, North America, South America, Asia, Europe, and Oceania with regards to the kilograms per capita per year, and then I have kind of that 2010 GDP. In terms of looking at this, in some respects you see a different response to income in the world, in Europe, in Oceania, and in North America as incomes have increased. And in some respects, I don't believe that bovine meat is a inferior good. Basically, I think we're seeing changes in consumer preference here. In terms of as individuals become wealthier in those countries, there is a shift away from the amount of cattle that are consumed on an annual basis. If you look at, for example, Asia still is in the situation that they're demanding more cattle in their diet as they become wealthier. Same type of in South America. As income increases, there's generally that upsloping aspect. In terms of if you look at that from a world perspective, we're consuming about 10 kilograms per capita per year of bovine. If we look at pig meat, very different story in all the world except a little bit with regards to Europe and North America, where in some respects that consumption is kind of leveled off as incomes increase. But if we look at the rest of the world, there's very strong increases in consumption as we move forward. In terms of this next one is poultry. Here, everything's upsloping. In terms of as people get more and more wealthy, there's more and more poultry consumption going on. And so I think it very clearly illustrates that while the world is at different levels, there's at least some agreement with regards to consumer preferences as wealth increases. In terms of egg consumption, you see a little bit different pattern there in terms of a flattening off in the US, a flattening off in Oceania, a flattening off generally in Europe. But again, if we look at Africa, South America, and Asia, and Africa, again, as incomes increase, there's more and more demand for animal protein through the egg. In terms of milk, same type of picture, kind of a dichotomous world there. A different situation in terms of Europe, the Oceania region, and North America compared to South America, Asia, and Africa. And then the last one is mutton and goat per capita consumption. Again, in the Oceania region, you've seen a huge decrease over time in that, and part of it is with incomes, part of it is a preference, and then you see relatively flat aspects. And so in some respects, these are the consumer preferences that are currently out there, and in some respects, that's kind of where the sustainability and the efficiency are going to have to go together as we move forward in the livestock industry. If we're going to go back to the UN definition of sustainability where consumers have food preferences, I think it's important to really understand what those preferences are as we think about the system going forward. The last thing I'm going to do is provide you a few statistics and hopefully to set the stage for the trade panel as it comes up. In terms of, again, export of animal products is growing over the globe, and we'll show that very quickly. And in some respects, different markets are concentrated in different ways. In terms of all of this is based on metric tons, and so I take the world exports from FAO Stat and essentially divide what are Brazilian exports, Australian exports, India, and Brazil exports 13.3% of the quantity of bovine meat, Australia 12%, India 11%, the US 9%, New Zealand 5%. These top 5 countries export 50%. The top 10 countries export 71%. On the import side, we're again looking at 11.2 million metric tons. The top importing country of bovine meat is the United States. The United States is also an importer and an exporter. Essentially, they're importing ground beef and exporting other cuts and then some of the offals. In terms of Vietnam's becoming a major importer, China, Japan, Hong Kong, again, 5 top importing countries receive 35% of the world's imports, and top 10 are 54. In terms of pig meat, and you'll see that as we go through these, the amount of trade is actually increasing. In terms of exporters, Germany, US, Spain, Denmark, Canada, together they export roughly 60% of what's exported in the world. And then the top exporting countries, the 10, roughly have 83%. Imports, China mainland, Japan, Germany, Italy, UK. Again, somewhat concentrated, but not as much as others. 41% are the top 5 importing countries. Top 10 importing countries are 62%. Poultry meat, again, the 2 major players there are Brazil and the US. The top 5 export 64%. The top 10 export 80%. On the import side, again, it's more diverse. The top 5 countries basically just have 30%. And so of all the shares, poultry production is just much smaller. Milk equivalents, essentially, here it is basically they take the dairy products and convert them back to milk equivalent. New Zealand, Germany, Netherlands, France, United States are the top exporters. And then essentially with the top 10 share, it's 71%. One of the things that if you begin to study the exporting countries, there begins to be patterns of countries that show up on product after product after product in terms of the top 5 or the top 10. Importing, essentially China mainland is the major importer in terms of quantities. And again, this is just a snapshot in 2016. And then you have Germany, Netherlands, Italy, and Belgium. I think probably what's most astounding here is if you just look at a graph over time in terms of quantity. In terms of what have happened to exports in our lifetime, if you go back to my lifetime, essentially they have essentially increased by about 9 times. And so the amount of trade that we're looking at has increased, and it's likely going to continue to increase. And so again, there's all kinds of issues that this is going to create with regards to sustainability in terms of how do you produce a global system where there's some individuals that are consuming and some individuals producing. And so certainly there is that aspect out there that trade is very important, and a lot of issues with regards to phytosanitary trade restrictions and other restrictions are really going to be important as we move forward, especially if you look at where the population is going to be. Trade has been increasing. It will continue to increase. There is this mismatch of production and consumption globally that is going to cause trade to increase and provide major shifts in production. And so in some respects, as we move forward, there's going to be some disruptive change given where the population is going and given where commodities are produced. The last slide I'm going to leave us with here is there was some discussion on plant-based protein. In terms of, I think it was a week or week and a half ago, essentially the individual that is co-founder and CEO of Whole Foods basically gives a little bit of the story, and I've kind of picked paragraphs out of this fairly long article. I have the site there if you want to take a look at the entire aspect. But to give you a little bit of background, John Mackey is the co-founder and CEO of Whole Foods. Whole Foods, for those of you that aren't from the U.S., is a very health-conscious, organic-conscious, nutritious-conscious type company. And essentially, the individual that's CEO, I think, is a vegan. In terms of that is his consumer preference. He was involved in Beyond Meat. There were a launching pad. Basically, it just indicates how that has grown. But then it kind of goes in terms of, but some of these are extremely popular now that are taking the world by storm. If you look at the ingredients, they are super highly processed foods. And so, again, he is kind of cautioning in terms of just from his own perspective, that natural versus processed. And then he kind of finishes up, I don't think eating highly processed foods is healthy. I think people thrive on eating whole foods. As for health, I will not endorse that, and that's as big a criticism that he's going to do in public. And so again, it is kind of interesting in terms of just thinking through some of these aspects. And that doesn't mean that highly processed product will not change formulation. In terms of we've had a lot of our food that has changed formulation, but I think that's something to think about as we go through in terms of the whole natural versus processed, the debate. In terms of consumers have lots of choices, and there's going to be a lot of confusion with regards to how they make those choices. And so again, I'll leave you with the concept that I think it's very important that we communicate the science in a way that's understandable both to the producer and the consumer, so that as they exercise their preferences, they're made on the best information that we have at this point. And so with that, I think we'll close.